Section 2 of 4 Science Fiction Stories by Alan E. Norse. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Bear Trap, Part 2. The Library of Congress had been moved when the threat of bombing in Washington had become acute. Shandor took a cab to Georgetown Airstrip, checked the fuel in the copter. 10 minutes later he started the motor, and headed upwind into the haze over the hills. In less than a half an hour he settled to the library landing field in western Maryland and strode across to the rear entrance. The electronic cross-index had been the last improvement in the library since the war with China had started in 1958. Shandor found a reading booth in one of the alcoves on the second floor and plugged in the index. The cold metallic voice of the automatic chirped twice and said, "Your reference, please." Shandor thought a moment. "Give me your newspaper files on David Ingersoll, Secretary of State." "Through which dates, please?" "Start with the earliest reference and carry through to the current." The speaker burped and he sat back waiting. A small gate in the panel before him popped open, and a small spool plopped out onto a spindle. Another followed, and another. He turned to the reader and reeled the first spool into the intake slot. The light snapped on and he began reading. Spools continued to plop down. He read for several hours, taking a dozen pages of notes. The references commenced in June 1961, with the small notice that David Ingersoll, Republican from New Jersey, had been nominated to run for state senator. Before that date, nothing. Shandor scowled, searching for some item predating that one. He found nothing. Scratching his head he continued reading, outlining chronologically Ingersoll's election to state senate, then to the United States Senate. His rise to national prominence as economist for the post-war administrator of President Drayton in 1966. His meteoric rise as a peacemaker in a nation tired from endless dreary years of fighting in China and India. His tremendous popularity as he tried to stall the re-intensifying Cold War with Russia. The first Nobel Peace Prize in 1969 for the ill-fated Ingersoll Plan for World Sovereignty. Pages and pages and pages of newsprint. Shandor growled angrily, surveying the pile of notes with a sinking feeling of incredulity. The articles, the writing, the tone, it was all too familiar. Carefully he checked the newspaper sources. Some of the dispatches were Associated Press. Many came direct desk from Public Information Board in New York. 2 other networks sponsored some of the wordage, but the tone was all the same. Finally, disgusted, Tom stuffed the notes into his briefcase and flipped down the librarian lever. "Sources, please." A light blinked, and in a moment a buzzer sounded at his elbow. A female voice, quite human, spoke as he lifted the receiver. "Can I help you on sources?" "Yes, I've been reading the newspaper files on David Ingersoll. I'd like the bylines on this copy." There was a moment of silence. "Which dates, please?" Shandor read off his list, giving dates. The silence continued for several minutes as he waited impatiently. He was about to hang up and leave when the voice spoke up again. "I'm sorry, sir. Most of that material has no byline. Except for 1 or 2 items, it's all staff written." "By whom?" "I'm sorry, no sources available. Perhaps the PIB offices could help you." "All right, ring them for me, please." He waited another 5 minutes, saw the PIB cross-index clerk appear on the video screen. "Hello, Mr. Shandor, can I help you?" "I'm trying to trace down the names of the Associated Press and PIB writers who covered stories on David Ingersoll over a period from June 1961 to the present date." The girl disappeared for several moments. When she reappeared her face was puzzled. "Why, Mr. Shandor, you've been doing all the work on Ingersoll from August 1978 to September 1982. We haven't closed the files on this last month yet." He scowled in annoyance. Yes, yes, I know that. I want the writers before I came." The clerk paused. "Until you started your work there was no definite assignment. The information just isn't here. But the man you replaced in PIB was named Frank Mariel." Chandler turned the name over in his mind, decided that it was familiar, but that he couldn't quite place it. "What's this man doing now?" The girl shrugged. "I don't know, just now, and I have no sources. But according to our files he left Public Information Board to go to work in some capacity for Dartmouth Bearing Corporation." Shandor flipped the switch and settled back in the reading chair. Once again he fingered through his notes, frowning, a doubt gnawing through his mind into certainty. He looked up a dozen of the stories, analyzed them carefully, word for word, sentence by sentence. Then he sat back, his body tired, eyes closed in concentration, an incredible idea twisting and writhing and solidifying in his mind. It takes one to catch one. That was his job, telling lies. Writing stories that weren't true, and making them believable. Making people think one thing when the truth was something else. It wasn't so strange that he could detect exactly the same sort of thing when he ran into it. He thought it through again, and every time he came up with the same answer. There was no doubt. Reading the newspaper files had accomplished only one thing. He had spent the afternoon reading a voluminous, neat, smoothly written, extremely convincing batch of bold-faced lies. Lies about David Ingersoll. Somewhere at the bottom of those lies was a shred or two of truth. A shred hard to analyze, impossible to segregate from the garbage surrounding it. But somebody had written the lies. That meant that somebody knew the truths behind them. Suddenly he galvanized into action. The video blinked protestingly at his urgent summons, and the Washington visiphone operator answered. "Somewhere in those listings of yours," Chandler said, "you've got a man named Frank Mariel. I want his number." He reached the downtown restaurant half an hour early, and ducked into a nearby visiphone station to ring Hart. The PIB director's chubby face materialized on the screen after a moment's confusion, and Chandler said, "John, what are your plans for releasing the Ingersoll story?" The morning papers left him with a slight head cold, if I remember right. Try as he would, he couldn't conceal the edge of sarcasm in his voice. Hart scowled. "How's the biography coming?" "The biography's coming along fine. I want to know what kind of quicksand I'm wading through, that's all." Hart shrugged and spread his hands. "We can't break the story proper until you're ready with your buffer story. Current plans say that he gets pneumonia tomorrow, and goes to Walter Reed tomorrow night. We're giving it as little emphasis as possible, running the Berlin Conference stories for right-hand column stuff. That'll give you all day tomorrow and half the next day for the preliminary stories on his death, okay?" "That's not enough time." Chandler's voice was tight. "It's enough for a buffer release." Hart scowled at him, his round face red and annoyed. "Look, Tom, you get that story in, and never mind what you like or don't like. This is dynamite you're playing with. The conference is going to be on the rocks in a matter of hours. That's straight from the undersecretary. And on top of it all, there's trouble down in Arizona." Chandler's eyes widened. "The rocket project?" Hart's mouth twisted. "Sabotage. They picked up the whole ring that's been operating for over a year. Caught them red-handed, but not before they burned out half the calculator wing. They'll have to move in new machines now before they can go on. Set the project back another week, and that could lose the war for us right there. Now get that story in." He snapped the switch down, leaving Chandler blinking at the darkened screen. 10 minutes later Ann Ingersoll joined him in the restaurant booth. She was wearing a chic white linen outfit, with her hair fresh, like a blonde halo around her head in the fading evening light. Her freshness contrasted painfully with Tom's curling collar and dirty tie, and he suddenly wished he'd picked up a shave. He looked up and grunted when he saw the fat briefcase under the girl's arm, and she dropped it on the table between them and sank down opposite him, studying his face. "The reading didn't go well," she said. "The reading went lousy," he admitted sheepishly. "This the personal file?" She nodded shortly and lit a cigarette. "The works. They didn't even bother me. But I can't see why all the precaution. I mean, the express and all that." Chandler looked at her sharply. "If what you said this morning was true, that file's a gold mine, for us, but more particularly for your father's enemies. I'll go over it closely when I get out of here. Meantime, there are one or two other things I want to talk over with you." She settled herself and grinned. "Okay, boss, fire away." He took a deep breath and tiredness lined his face. "First off, what did your father do before he went into politics?" Her eyes widened, and she arrested the cigarette halfway to her mouth, put it back on the ash tray, with a puzzled frown on her face. "That's funny," she said softly. "I thought I knew, but I guess I don't. He was an industrialist, way far back, years and years ago, when I was just a little brat. And then we got into the war with China, and I don't know what he did. He was always making business trips. I can remember going to the airport with Mother to meet him, but I don't know what he did. Mother always avoided talking about him, and I never got to see him enough to talk." Chandler sat forward, his eyes bright. "Did he ever entertain any business friends during that time, any that you can remember?" She shook her head. "I can't remember. Seems to me a man or two came home with him on a couple of occasions, but I don't know who. I don't remember much before the night he came home and said he was going to run for Congress. Then there were people galore. Have been ever since." "And what about his work at the end of the China War? After he was elected, while he was doing all that work to try to smooth things out with Russia, can you remember him saying anything to you or to your mother about what he was doing, and how?" She shook her head again. "Oh, yes, he'd talk. He and Mother would talk. Sometimes argue. I had the feeling that things weren't too well with Mother and Dad many times, but I can't remember anything specific, except that he used to say over and over how he hated the thought of another war. He was afraid it was going to come." Chandler looked up sharply. "But he hated it." "Yes." Her eyes widened. "Oh, yes, he hated it. Dad was a good man, Tom. He believed with all his heart that the people of the world wanted peace, and that they were being dragged to war, because they couldn't find any purpose to keep them from it. He believed that if the people of the world had a cause, a purpose, a driving force, that there wouldn't be any more wars. Some men fought him for preaching peace, but he wouldn't be swayed. Especially he hated the pure profit lobbies, the patriotic drumbeaters who stood to get rich in a war. But Dad had to die, and there aren't many men like him left now, I guess." "I know." Chandler fell silent, stirring his coffee glumly. "Tell me," he said, "did your father have anything to do with a man named Mariel?" Ann's eyes narrowed. "Frank Mariel?" "He was the newspaper man." "Yes, Dad had plenty to do with him. He hated Dad's guts, because Dad fought his writing so much. Mariel was one of the fight now and get rich school that were continually plaguing Dad." "Would you say that they were enemies?" She bit her lip, wrinkling her brow in thought. "Not at first. More like a big dog with a little flea at first. Mariel pestered Dad, and Dad tried to scratch him away. But Mariel got into PIB, and then I suppose you could call them enemies." Chandler sat back, frowning, his face dark with fatigue. He stared at the table top for a long moment, and when he looked up at the girl his eyes were troubled. "There's something wrong with this," he said softly. "I can't quite make it out, but it just doesn't look right. Those newspaper stories I read, pure bourgeois, from beginning to end. I'm dead certain of it. And yet—" he paused, searching for words. "Look, it's like I'm looking at a jigsaw puzzle that looks like it's all completed and lying out on a table,